Lovely to see everybody. Um, my name is Susan Shillinglaw, and I'm retired from San Jose State, where I taught for some 34 years. And I taught a Steinbeck. I was lucky enough to teach a Steinbeck class every year because I was director of the Center for Steinbeck Studies there at San Jose State. And so I have taught this book many times, and I always enjoyed it. And I always thought it was going to be more controversial than it was. Students very much liked it and enjoyed the sort of the humor and just the kind of the complexity of it, which I'm going to talk a little bit about, but also in book group. So those of you who want to read it and talk about it, I hope you come to book group. I'm going to just kind of talk about the context of the book today, some about the book itself, and then I will have a period for questions and answers. You can put things in the chat room and I'll try to answer them as I go along if you want to. But just if anybody has any questions before I start, let me know. Also, I do want to say that I think Andres is introducing the Tortilla Flat film, correct? Andres?
Yeah, I'll be introducing it.
And he has a background in film, so he left himself out of that flyer when he was talking about it. So it's always fun to have a film introduced, and Tortilla Flat is quite an interesting film. So I'm looking forward to it. So thanks, Andres. Okay, with that, I'm going to have some slides and some pictures and PowerPoint. So here we go. Let's see if I can do this. There we go. So my talk is entitled Steinbeck and Mexico, Steinbeck and Paisanos, because I want to talk about the context of Steinbeck writing about Mexico and about Mexicans in California and Mexicans in Spanish and sort of heritage of that Spanish-Mexican tradition in California, because he was interested in both. So that's the context of my talk. It has 3 parts to it. First of all, he dreamed of going to Mexico when he was young. He was familiar with Mexico when he was very young. In Salinas, he would have seen workers in the fields, and he worked at Spreckels Sugar alongside Mexican workers. Some of the stories in this Tortilla Flat he heard at Spreckels. One of his neighbors, the Wagners, Mrs. Wagner, had been a journalist in the Mexican Revolution, so he was very curious about her and went to visit her a lot. Later, when he went to Stanford, he talked to his college roommate about going to Mexico. They always talked about it as a golden place and dreamed to go there. Now you have to think this is, 1930s California. The Mexican Revolution is over. They're curious to go to a place that's familiar in California, the history of Mexico, and also something seemingly exotic, and obviously a country that speaks another language, etc. So he yearned to go to Mexico when he was at Stanford. He planned to go to Mexico in 1932 and 1934, and finally went in 1935. So I'm going to talk about that. Second part is Mexico and the US, considering Mexican Americans and what his characters are like in the various books that he wrote before Tortilla Flat and after. And some of the questions that are raised about Steinbeck's treatment of Mexican Americans is, does Tortilla Flat celebrate laziness and drunkenness, which is a central question that I'll touch on. And in the Labor trilogy of Mice and Men, in Dubious Battle and The Grapes of Wrath, Steinbeck has been criticized for not showing the ethnic diversity of the labor force. I'm going to kind of talk about why briefly he doesn't do that. And finally, I'm going to talk about the many books he wrote about Mexico, because you have to put this book, Tortilla Flat, in the context of all the ways that he considered and thought about Mexican Americans, Mexico, and the Mexican people. He went to see Cortez in 1940. He worked on a film, a really interesting documentary called A Forgotten Village, which was released shortly there next year. He wrote The Pearl. The Pearl became a film, and then the film of Viva Zapata in 1952, which he worked on with Elia Kazan. Okay, next. So part one, Steinbeck's dream of Mexico. And here's where he grew up, obviously. And I think it's really important, these stories that he heard from Mrs. Wagner. He used to go across the street. She lived across the street on Central Avenue, and listen to her stories of the Mexican Revolution. Imagine how exotic that must have been for a young boy who was kind of dreamy, who wanted to be a writer, and who was kind of looking for material. But if you have a neighbor who's been involved as a journalist in the Mexican Revolution, it must have been a very tantalizing visits that he paid to her house. He used to read aloud his stories to her as well. And you couldn't look at, Salinas and the fields around Salinas without seeing laborers in the field. I was struck by the fact that, I was teaching Wallace Stegner, and he talked about growing up in an empty land. He grew up in southern Canada for many years, and he said that just the fact that the spaces were empty. Well, spaces in California in the Salinas Valley were never empty. They always contained workers, and I think that's very much a part of all of Steinbeck's landscapes, if you think about the people in them that he would have seen. This is a typical scene, late 19th century, early 20th century, digging irrigation ditches for speckled sugar. And you can see the labor force is clearly an ethnic mix. And, using the short handle hoe in the fields, he would have seen laborers bent over crops. Later on, he said, and I think this was his attitude pretty much all of his life. I think he grew up empathetic for those on the margins. He said, "From the very first, we have treated our minorities abominably, the way the old boys do the new kids at school. All that was required was to release this mechanism of oppression and sadism, was that the newcomers be meek, poor, weak in numbers, and unprotected." So as a young man, he was empathetic, certainly for the plight of the Mexicans that he knew in Salinas. As I said, it was a destination that he dreamed of. He wrote his agent that he wanted to go to Mazatlan, and from there I shall go on horseback in the general direction of Guadalajara. Now imagine just taking off on a horse and touring Mexico. And he wanted to write about little Mexican villages. "I plan to do a series of little stories on the road, local sagas. Such things might be done well with simplicity and color and charm, if one were able to present the incident against its background and at the same time permeate it with the state of mind of its community." Now, that's really a statement of artistic intent in most all of Steinbeck's books. He wanted to show the people in the context of their environment. And so that's how he wanted to write about Mexico. A couple of years later, he said he wanted to go to La Paz. I have no idea what he'd heard about La Paz in 1934 and how he knew it was beautiful and cheap of access and forgotten. But that was a destination that he wanted to go there and observe the people. He finally got to Mexico in 1935. It was the first place he went when he got money. And he got money with the publication of Tortilla Flat, actually, because he was paid $4,000 for the film rights for Tortilla Flat. And for somebody who's been living on $25 a month, occasional selling a short story, he got $50 for selling The Red Pony. Imagine getting $4,000, you would be, wealthy. So they took their first trip abroad, and they went to Mexico, he and Carol. They took the new highway, the new Trans-American highway that went down to Mexico City. It was perilous trip. I love this cartoon, which was in Carol Steinbeck's scrapbooks, She kept these random scrapbooks of events that they shared during their marriage. Pablo's off to the United States to get material for a book. Well, the opposite was happening. A lot of Americans were, of course, going to Mexico to get material for books. Here's a drawing that a friend did of their escape to Mexico, Carol and John, and presented them with this card when they left. Here's their migration card. And they went on the longest highway in the world that went from to Mexico City on the Pan American Highway. That it was intended to go all the way down to South America. And here's what a kind of a scene of what they would have seen. This is not a picture that was in Carol's scrapbook, but, oh, it is a picture, I'm sorry, that was from Carol's scrapbook, but she wrote about perambulating haystacks. She kept a diary on their trip down the south along this highway. I wrote about it. I wrote a biography of Carol and John Steinbeck, and I quote a little bit from her diary that she wrote and they're basically scenes along the road. She was clearly entranced by everything they saw in Mexico. Here she is in Mexico City with the two maids that they had in their house. Look how happy she looks. Both of them were happy, and they said, Steinbeck said, I'm not getting any work done here because I love looking out the window too much. So they really loved their first trip to Mexico and, seeing Mexico. So part two is Mexico and the US, considering Mexican Americans. And I want to just, think about the list of books that directly include Mexican American characters. Pastures of Heaven has a little story about two sisters who make tortillas. Has another story called about Tularicito, who is a kind of an artistic savant. Both interesting kind of ways to look at marginalized characters in the society and how they're treated. To a God Unknown, which is set in the Mission San Antonio, has several characters, Mexican Spanish characters or paisanos who kind of advise the central hero and clearly who know more about the region and the landscapes than he does. Flight is about Pepe, a Mexican American who kills a man in Monterey and has to flee into the Big Sur Mountains. Of course, Tortilla Flat. Wayward Bus was supposed to be about a bus trip through Mexico, but he changed it to the United States because he knew the landscape better. And Sweet Thursday contains a Mexican American owner of Lee Chong's grocery, because Lee Chong has moved away, and so a Mexican takes over the grocery store, which is a kind of funny aside. But here's, Mission San Antonio, where he's set to a God Unknown. I mean, clearly this is a place, it's a mission. You have the mission history embedded in the book and the background, the treatment of the native peoples, etc. So, Steinbeck had been there when he was writing, when he was young, and he set his novel there in a region very much imbued with a sense of the history of Spanish and Mexico and California. Here's Flight, which is an initiation story. A boy gets to be a man when a man is needed. Remember this thing, I've known boys 40 years old because there was no need for a man. And it's kind of what the meaning of manhood is. Pepe kills a man with a knife, which is a kind of instinctive lashing out at a fight in Monterey. And then he has to go into the mountains and he's hunted like an animal. So the question of manhood kind of reverberates in the story. It's included in the Long Valley. And then Wayward Bus, I love this quote. The truth was she didn't want to go to Mexico. She just wanted to come back to tell friends she's having, I can't see my whole quote, to her friends having been to Mexico. her husband didn't want to go at all. He was doing it for his family and because he hoped it would do him good in a cultural way. He kind of, obviously there's some irony there about why you want to go to Mexico and the reasons for wanting to go to Mexico. And then this is the quote from Sweet Thursday. There was the Mexican who takes over the grocery store, Lee Chong's grocery store, starts a mariachi band and 2 guitars, a guitar on, rhythm, Macarena man, a tenor, 2 baritones. He would have had the whole lot deported if his nephew had not joined them with the hot trumpet. So they're all kind of migrants who could be deported. And so there's humor about this band throughout Sweet Thursday. So my point here is that, Steinbeck wrote a lot about Mexico, Mexican Americans, paisanos, in addition to Tortilla Flat. So it's important to see the book in the context of Steinbeck's longstanding interest in Mexico. Well, to talk a little bit about Tortilla Flat, I'm going to kind of note a lot of these illustrations that were done for the book by Peggy Worthington. Steinbeck was lucky in that he had great artists do covers for his books and illustrations for his books. For instance, Thomas Hart Benton illustrated an edition of The Grapes of Wrath. Peggy Worthington and another artist both illustrated Tortilla Flat, and Orozco, Mexican artist, illustrated The Pearl. So, it's not the visual quality of Steinbeck's prose sort of lent itself to, I think, interpretations by artists about what exactly Steinbeck was depicting. Here's a picture of, obviously, Monterey Bay, which Steinbeck calls in the book a blue platter. So I love that description because it does look like a blue platter. But let me just give you a little bit of the context of his writing, Tortilla Flat. He wrote it when his mother had fallen ill. She had a stroke and she was dying in the house in Salinas. So he went to home to Salinas to take care of her. That's where he wrote 2 books, in their, we'll see, certainly large parts of 2 books, The Red Pony and the Red Pony Stories and Tortilla Flat. And he said its tone, I guess, is in direct rebellion against all the sorrow of our house. And it's interesting to think of his own kind of psychological state as he was writing Tortilla Flat, because it is funny and it's also mournful. And I think those 2 emotions were kind of in conflict in Steinbeck's own sort of psyche as he went home to take care of his mother, and childhood memories came back, and also, just the sorrow at watching his mother die. Also in this book, he had been living in LA before he moved back to Salinas in 1933. He and Carol moved back to the Salinas house to take care of Olive. But he had been, when he was in Southern California, he'd been really working out with a friend of his, this notion of group man and group behavior. And he was interested in how individuals, when they come together as a group, become very different kind of entity than individuals who are, how they act alone or how they act when they're on their own. And as he said, all of the notations I have made begin to point to an end, that the group is an individual as boundaried, as disposable, as dependent on its unit, and as independent of its unit's individual nature as the human or man is dependent on his cells and is yet independent of them. Now, there's many quotations to describe group man, or the phalanx theory, which is, part of Steinbeck's work in Dubious Battle, what happens in a group of strikers in The Grapes of Wrath, what happens when migrants come together as one group. he's just interested in that shift from individual to group. But here, I think the very fact that he sees a biological kind of grounding for this theory is important, because he's thinking about his mother as a new kind of identity and unit, who's very separate from the cells that make up her body. So he's thinking of her and of the group of men forming a new individual or a new unit. And so Tortilla Flat has some of that sense, obviously, of what happens when these individuals come together as a new unit or as a group. It was Tortilla Flat, the book was published in May 1935. It was rejected by many, many publishers. And he was discouraged. And finally, at a party, he read a couple of the stories one night. He loved to read aloud, by the way. And a friend said, "Oh, come on, send it off again." So he sent it off one more time, and it was accepted. And it became his kind of breakthrough novel. It was very popular. It sold a lot. It was widely read. And it was illustrated by Ruth Gannett, whose husband was the book reviewer for the Herald Tribune. And then in 1947, these are the illustrations I'm going to show in this PowerPoint, was illustrated again by Peggy Worthington. And all the characters in the book are familiar figures in Monterey. So he's really writing about real people, as he so often does. Obviously, everyone in Cannery Row is real as well. As Dennis said, he wrote a lot about stories that he heard from his friend Sue Gregory, who was a high school Spanish teacher at Monterey High School. And he would go over to her house and listen to her stories. Also the stories of Sue's friend, Hattie Gregg, who was an old, was related to the Hartnells and was from an old Monterey family. So he loved to listen to stories. And, you say, oh, well, Steinbeck just picked up other people's stories. In point of fact, he was, as he said, I'm a shameless magpie. He listened and, they became, part of the material of life that he used in his own fiction. And Sue wasn't going to write the stories. She was just telling them orally. And, Steinbeck wrote them down. But there's her house. And that probably is the tortilla flat that Steinbeck is describing. But there were other tortilla flats in the Monterey region, because any region or enclave that had a lot of Mexican residents was called throughout California tortilla flat or tortilla flats, plural. So there was this one, there was behind MPC, another area, Iris Canyon. There was an area called Tortilla Flats up by where the old Carmel Hospital was. So, it was a kind of composite location. And that was typical for Steinbeck. He said, I don't have, my landscapes aren't necessarily absolutely accurate. I use, composite locations. And that's true here, because that mingling of forest and town is somewhat true of Johnson Avenue, more true of Iris Canyon and the old site of the hospital. He starts out the book in the preface asking a question that I think is, it kind of reverberates throughout the novella. What is a paisano? He's a mixture of Spanish, Indian, Mexican, and assorted Caucasian bloods. His ancestors have lived in California for 100 or 2 years. So there's that sense that this is a kind of mongrel type, a mixture of bloods. And I think for Steinbeck, that's whole sense of, having this kind of indeterminate character who shares, a lot of, bloodlines and lives between forest and town in this kind of liminal space that is not, forest and is not city of Monterey. It's in between. The lots are always weedy. They're neglected. So the sense of these how do you define marginalized characters? You define them through their heritage, through where they live, and through their, natural world. They're weeds. They're things that we don't often look at. They're things we don't often pay attention to. And basically, Steinbeck is starting out his book with a definition of paisanos so that we pay attention. Here they are. Here's who they are. Take heed. I'm going to read you a little bit from the book that I published long ago in 2006, but I talk about kind of some of the stories I think that inspired Steinbeck as he was writing this. Steinbeck knew about the paisanos of Monterey. Their exploits were the stuff of news stories. Pilon of Tortilla Flat was in life Eduardo Romero, called Pilon by friends, quote, a chronic thorn in the side of Monterey police who inspired many of Steinbeck's yarns, reported the Monterey Peninsula Herald in 1957, the year Pilon died. He was, quote, truly an institution in the community, added municipal judge Ray Baugh, the man who was called to sentence him from time to time. Pilon and Eddie Martin lived in Iris Canyon in Monterey. Rows of wine bottles lined up outside their camp. Quote, absolutely, Pilon and me, we was just like brothers, Martin said in 1957 at his proclaimed age of 97. Quote, we was always together. When you see one, you wait a few seconds, then you see the other one. When Pilon got drunk with Eduardo one day in 1953, he stabbed his friend and was charged for the crime. Steinbeck wired a telegram to Judge Baugh. I protest Pilon's arrest. Are the times so degenerate? Since when it is a crime to knife your friend? Pilon's motive was certainly pure, probably philanthropic, and possibly noble. Judge Baugh, who is a paisano himself, will surely gild justice with understanding. And Judge Baugh did so. So I love the sort of, you can kind of look through the papers and see all this kind of lore about the paisanos, who were real characters in Monterey, very well known. Pirate had dogs. There was a pirate who had lots of dogs. And so a lot of what Steinbeck was writing about would have been familiar to people who lived here. Now, one of the things that whenever I teach this book, I always kind of think about whether it's going to seem objectionable to, any students who are of Mexican heritage. And I think, because it's a lot of drinking and carousing and they don't work and they seem lazy. Does this just reinforce stereotypes? And I think that's a question you have to talk about and discuss. This is a quotation that I recently got from Penguin Press because they're working on, how to kind of make text relevant to today's classrooms. How does this text support or challenge issues of representation, fairness, or justice? How does this text perpetuate or subvert dominant power dynamics and ideologies? Now, when I talk about this in classes, I always try to say, look, this is not Steinbeck's full portrait of Mexico or Mexicans. And that's kind of where I started with this talk, showing you the context. And then, it's not like all Mexicans drink. It's that this little enclave, some of these paisanos do drink. And so I think you kind of have to place the book in context. It's called A History, and it starts with, and this has always intrigued me, it starts with war in Germany, because the paisanos are coming back from having enlisted in the war and having these various experiences in war. Why start with war? And I think to some extent, for Steinbeck, they survive. And that's kind of a way to look at their characters. They're survivors. And Steinbeck is always kind of intrigued by those who live on the margins and triumph. They have their survivability quotient, which is a term that Ed Ricketts, his best friend, used, is very strong, very vigorous. They can do it. They can get by. They can make it. And the way he talks about them is that they are kind of outside the economic structure of Monterey. They're free of the complicated systems of American business. Danny, quote, stole 2 slices of ham, 4 eggs, a lamb chop, and a fly swatter at one point. they share brandy. While I have a house, thou hast a house. So their ethical base and their ethical structure is very different from the dominant cultures. They kill a rooster on the side of the road, and they, they justify that. They barter to get what they want. They don't pay rent, of course. Danny rents them a house, and of course, Pilon is not going to pay the rent. It's not even expected that he pay the rent. They have a present of wine. They cozen their supper. So it's all about barter. In other words, in some ways, the book is a kind of an attack on American capitalism by presenting a alternative economic system, which is based on barter and exchange. That's also true, by the way, in Cannery Row, where frogs become the money that you use, kind of frog money, rather than, the money of the recognized by the dominant culture. So, and if you think about Tortilla Flat and you think, okay, is he saying that this is a portrait of all Mexicans? Is he saying that essentially all Mexicans are like this? Essentialist comments are ones made when you say, for instance, women, that Rosa will want new dresses. All women do. I know them. Now that's a comment one of the paisanos makes, but it's not, Steinbeck, and it's not what Steinbeck says about the paisanos. Or Portuguese, Big Joe Portuguese. Portuguese always want to marry, and they love money. It's those kind of essentialist, dismissive remarks that, the paisanos might make of others, but that Steinbeck is really not making about the paisanos. Italians, Torelli had, Pilon knew, the Italians exaggerated and wholly quixotic ideal of marital relations. So, there's these comments scattered throughout the books, and those are essentialist comments, but Steinbeck, I think, is doing something else in this book. As I said before, they are, where they live, and this is such a lovely description, on the hill where the forest and the town intermingle, where the streets are innocent of asphalt and the corners free of street lights. The old inhabitants of Monterey are embattled as the ancient Britons are embattled in Wales. They're paisanos. They live in old wooden houses set in weedy yards, and the pine trees from the forests are about the houses. You see that kind of in-between space is where they live. And they even have a kind of in-between, the characters are seen in a kind of in-between space because they're like ancient Britons. The dominant kind of metaphor throughout the book is the Arthurian Round Table. So they're both ancient Britons and paisanos at the same time. So he wants this kind of in-between space for his characters. Here are some of the illustrations, and another kind of quotation I think that I love. Pilon was a lover of beauty and a mystic. Our fathers in the evening, he thought, these birds are flying across the forehead of the father. Dear birds, dear seagulls, how I love you all. And I love that picture of the seagull and the mystic Pilon floating in the air. As he watched the birds, he remembered that Miss Pastano used seagulls sometimes in her tamales. Now that's funny, the juxtaposition of the real and the slightly unsavory, seagulls and tamales versus the spiritual, idealizing, our Father who art in nature, that kind of thing. And Steinbeck, again, this in-between space. Steinbeck is always kind of operating in this space between the factual and the kind of yearning, the spiritual. And that's the kind of the terrain that he writes in throughout his career. He's not a realist. He's really somebody who writes in between being writing fables, writing stories that are based on the abstract or the metaphysical, and then the very, very concrete and factual. So drinking in Tortilla Flat. Now there is a lot of drinking. And it's, it's funny, and it's amusing. And again, they barter for drink. Talon Thomas always reads this. He does it much better than I, but I do love this passage, which is in chapter 3. 2 gallons is a great deal of wine, even for 2 paisanos. Spiritually, the jugs must be graduated thus. Just below the shoulder of the first bottle, serious and concentrated conversation. 2 inches further down, sweet, sad memory. 3 inches more, thoughts of old and satisfactory loves. An inch, thoughts of bitter loves. Bottom of the first jug, general and undirected sadness. Shoulder of the second jug, black, unholy despondency. 2 fingers down, a song of death or longing. A thumb, every other song each one knows. The gradations stop here, for the trail splits and there is no certainty. From this point on, anything can happen. So, it's funny, because it's a dissection of drink. And, the paisanos spent a lot of time drinking. They drank the quart of grappa, and there was just enough to promote the sweetness of comradeship. But Steinbeck says in Sea of Cortez, and I love this quote, when he talks about their own drinking on the 1940 trip to Baja, we did not drink too much. We drank just enough, and we refused to profane a good little time of mild inebriety with that slurring phrase, overindulgence. Actually, with few tribal exceptions, our race has a triumphant alcoholic history, and no definite symptoms of degeneracy can be attributed to it. The theory that alcohol is a poison was too easily and too blindly accepted. Now, there is a book called Alcoholics in American Literature, and there is a chapter about Steinbeck in it. But Steinbeck was not an alcoholic. Other chapters include Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Faulkner. They did have serious problems with alcohol, but Steinbeck was a heavy drinker, as was Ricketts. But they could stop. They weren't obsessed with alcohol or dependent on alcohol. Indeed, one of the things Steinbeck said when he won the Nobel Prize, when he went to Sweden, he said, I'm not going to drink at all because I don't want to follow, Faulkner and Hemingway and be an American drunk. So he didn't drink anything. So, but the paisanos, I think, let me go back to this one. I think there's a couple more things I want to say about that. They do drink, but what he wants to is not the drinking itself. And he says this in another context. He says it's not the drinking, it's what it brings them. It's that sense of friendship and camaraderie and loyalty and stories and the sharing of something. It's all those qualities that they value. Because when Steinbeck is writing about the paisanos and their culture, the traits that he wants to show that the paisanos really are loyal to one another. They enjoy relaxing with one another. They enjoy eating and drinking and fellowship. And that's what drink brings them, that sense of fellowship and that bond. It's good to have friends. How lonely it is in the world if there are no friends to sit with one and share one's grappa. It's that quality of friendship that is important, not the alcohol itself. It shall be our burden and our duty to see there is always food in the house for Danny. Chapter 4. And this sense of how they talk about drink, but also other qualities. The bottom of the ditch was choked with dry grass and brushes. The arms stirred, swept back the bushes, disclosed the frowsy face and red stubble beard of Jesus Maria Corcoran. Jesus Maria was a humanitarian, and kindness was always in him. Now, as you read the book, note that all the characters are defined by qualities of their character, not by their habits. Jesus Maria was a humanitarian. The story was gradually taking place. Pilon liked it that way. It ruined a story to have it all come out quickly. The good story lay in half-told things, which must be filled in out of the hearer's own experience. That's a great quotation. And that also says a lot about Steinbeck's theory of art. That the good story lay in half-told things, which we, as we read it, have to think about and participate in to decide whether or not we like a work. How does our own reading of it, how does our own experience reading it add to our pleasure in the story? Just to come back to this notion of friendship and drinking, I always ask my students, if they were offended by the portrait of, as I said, the paisanos. And in my last class that I taught, last Steinbeck class that I taught, one young man raised his hand, and he said, "Offended? What do you mean? These are my uncles." So I've always thought about that, there is a sense that, that it was familiar to him. So his participation was that it seemed like the camaraderie, the friendship, the group, the sense of loyalty seemed like his family. Here's Pirate. Isn't this a wonderful picture of all these dogs looking up at Pirate? The pirate's dogs, if they suspected ill of anyone toward their master, were known to become defending furies. Here he's telling, Pirate is telling the dogs the story of what happened in church. Just a wonderful picture. Pirate and his dogs, his head had not grown with the rest of his body. He's one of Steinbeck's many characters who are kind of, as he calls them in Pastures of Heaven, God's unfinished people. Why does he write about people who are mentally challenged? Probably because he's always looking at how the community responds to those characters. So it's not about demeaning the character, but to what extent are they accepted or reviled by others? And that's kind of a measure, just like Lenny and Of Mice and Men. What's important is how the other characters in the book are responding to Lenny, and whether or not they dismiss him or can see value in who and what he is. Here's another St. Andrew's Eve, another beautiful description. And really, Steinbeck is coming into his own. I think in 1933, when he wrote these two books, Tortilla Flat and The Red Pony, some of his best writing is in these two stories, and he really is kind of coming into his mature style. The wind arose as they walked and drove the fog across the pale moon like a thin wash of gray watercolor. The moving fog gave shifting form to the forest so that every tree crept stealthily along, and the bushes moved soundlessly like dark cats. The treetops and the wild talked huskily, told fortunes and foretold dreams, foretold deaths. The trees coming alive in the forest on St. Andrew's Eve. And look at that picture of the trees kind of looming in the sense of something magical happening here. Again, the terrain that Steinbeck always chooses to write his books in, that half magical, half kind of evocative, spiritual place, and then the reality of people's lives. The book, of course, ends in inflagration and fire. Why? I think, the sense of the round table, back to the round table, which he tells you in the beginning, it's about the creation and the flowering of something that is worthwhile and is very fragile. And then what happens to that fragile entity? And that's kind of the arc of the book. I love that Dutch edition cover because it really captures the friendship. It became a play shortly after the book was published in 1935 on Broadway, and it was a flop. Jack Kirkland adapted it for the stage, but Steinbeck wanted to have an all-Mexican company. they won't have to bother about accent and all that. The actors won't be able to talk in any other way. We expect to pick up our cast in and around in LA. Now that was a pipe dream. I don't, he wanted to have an all Mexican company. He wanted it to be accurate and to seem, appropriate, but Jack Kirkland did not. It was too expensive. It was too difficult. So that didn't happen. And Steinbeck was terribly disappointed in the play. He got a copy of the drama before it opened on Broadway, and he said there's so many little undertones that he has got wrong, Jack Kirkland. I don't want to maintain my book, but I would like to maintain the people as I know them. Let me give you an example. Jack makes them want wine and need wine and suffer for wine, whereas they want the thing that wine does. They're not drunkards at all. They like the love and the fights that come with wine rather than the wine itself. He has lots of other little comments about the script like that Jack Kirkland simply didn't understand the culture. And Steinbeck felt that he did, at least as much as an outsider could. Now, in closing, I just want to talk a little bit about, Steinbeck's other Mexican works and how much he was fascinated with the country, the culture, the landscape, etc. And I love showing this picture when I talk about Steinbeck in Mexico, because I think it shows that sense of division that's possible to feel when one's trying to consider the difference between two countries without sounding like you're, trying to, again, be essential. All Italians love to eat, all the French, know how to drink wine, etc. But what are the differences in cultures? And this is Frida Kahlo, who painted this when she was living in Detroit. Her husband was painting, Diego Rivera was painting a mural in Detroit, and she was not very happy in the United States. So she painted a self-portrait between the borderline of Mexican and the United States in 1932. And look at the difference. The United States is all sharp lines and pipes, loudspeakers, smoke, factories, straight lines. Everything is, angular, versus Mexico, which is ancient civilizations, the sense of nature, the sun and the moon, the deities that were so much a part of the Mexican religion, roots, plants, roots, things that are rooted and natural. And she stands, between those two worlds. But you can see with her Mexican flag in her hand which world she favors. And I think to a large extent, Steinbeck, who was always interested in kind of marginalized people, think of the Jodes and the workers that he wrote about in the late 1930s, was interested in Mexico as a country that seemed very different and had values that he cared about in terms of his own kind of rejection of middle class and dominant culture values. He wrote, "I think the error which amuses and infuriates me more than any other is the claim of our people to civilization. They actually believe they're more civilized than African savages." Now, that's an unfortunate phrase, but so be it. "We have autos and cars," they say. "We have telephones, and 99% of the people couldn't even smelt a piece of copper to make a knife, let alone build a telephone. Every savage knows 100 times more about science than your exchange club speaker. Our people haven't learned the first level lesson of civilization, how to be happy." And I think Tortilla Flat is really about happy people, at least certainly in the first part of the book. There's that. So if you think, oh, he's just attracted to uncivilized or, people. I heard a talk once that, when you use words like savages or uncivilized, it's not that you're just attracted to primitive civilizations and that it's the rich Westerner looking at another civilization saying, aren't they quaint? That if you change your word to say it's primary cultures that we're studying and we're intrigued with, they have primary values. I think that kind of explains a lot about Steinbeck's Mexico and the appeal of Mexico for Steinbeck. He found kind of primary culture that he valued in the simplicity, in the connection with nature, in the loyalty of families, in the just the integrity of the people. So, of course, the books he wrote about Mexico, he went in 1940 and wrote Sea of Cortez. I'm not going to talk about it, but it certainly is one of his, it was his favorite of all the books he wrote. And it's about travel in Baja and the Gulf to collect specimens with his best friend, Ed Ricketts. On the Western Flyer, which many of you may have seen when it was returned to Monterey or saw at Whale Fest, or it is docked at Moss Landing and will soon be going to sea more as an educational vessel. Lots of students in Monterey have been doing some dockside educational work on the Western Flyer, and we'll be doing more of that. But it's a restored purse seiner that John Gregg restored because he cared so much about Steinbeck and about this journey they took in 1940 to the Sea of Cortez. So we now have the Western Flyer back on the Monterey Peninsula. Right after he did that, he did a really curious documentary film, which is rarely shown, but it's quite interesting. And it's about a forgotten village. And he wanted to film exactly what happened in a small village where there was a cholera epidemic. And it's about the kind of clash between the curandera, who wants to cure cholera with snake skins and chants and things like that, versus modern medicine. It's frankly, it's propagandistic because Steinbeck was trying to support the Mexican government in their effort to bring both education and medical advanced medicine to some of the poor communities around Mexico. And so Steinbeck kind of wrote this film to kind of talk about or help the Mexican government shore up that program. Right after he got back from World War II, he was a journalist overseas in World War II. He said to Gwen, his second wife, "I've got to get out of here. I can't stand New York. I can't stand still. Let's go to Mexico." Indeed, the appeal of Mexico, and he toured Mexico. They went to Oaxaca, went to Mitla and Mate Alban, and then to Cuernavaca, and then San Miguel Allende. So he just needed to get away from New York, from the US, and go to Mexico. He then wrote The Pearl, which is based on a story he heard on the Sea of Cortez trip in 1940. The Pearl was written as a film. So it's a short story, and he knew it was going to become a film. So it has that visual quality. It's a parable of of a young man who wants to become wealthy by finding, or does find, a huge pearl and wants to become wealthy, with the sale of the pearl and what that does to his family. So here are the drawings by Orozco of the family and the pearl diver. And oops, I had more. I guess they got, and he wanted it to be filmed, and again, he wanted to be filmed in Mexico by a Mexican with Mexican financing. Do you see how much he kept trying to have things authentically Mexican when he was writing? And he said, the pearl is a balancing of tone and rhythm and image. It was a folk tale, a parable. It was not filmed in Mexico, but it did have Mexican actors in it and a Mexican director. There are the other two pictures by Orozco. And then finally, he was very much interested in the Mexican Revolution, and he started in the same time that he was working on the film of The Pearl. He started researching the life of Emilio Zapata and worked with Elia Kazan on this film about the life of Zapata and the kind of betrayal of Zapata. So there it is. And here's what Steinbeck had to say on it. And he went again to Mexico to scout for a setting of the film. The trip to Mexico is very interesting. The party line was everywhere. I do not want to be one of the fearful ones, and I'm afraid of the other side too. But if this film should be killed, it'll be by the Communist Party, not the other side. For it seems to me the communists are the real reactionaries of the world. That's strange, but it seems to be true. So he kind of launched into, politics and Mexican politics. And, that's why he was interested in the revolution and what kind of fairness was it bringing to the peasants, etc. I can't quite tell you what I fear in Mexico, he added, but you must know that in Mexico, Zapata has taken as a symbol of both the communists and the fascist parties. Both use him, and I wouldn't be surprised if they united to fight us damned imperialist. Kazan is mad. He says he'll make it in Mexico in spite of them, and I believe he will. So you see that his interest in Mexico was, was far more complex than just, oh, here, isn't this an exotic locale? Aren't these people, simple and colorful? But he was involved in politics and what the government was doing for healthcare in the villages, what, the holistic sensibilities that he explores in Sea of Cortez. So Mexico was a kind of, I think, freed him in a way to write fully and of things that he cared about, values that he cared about. For him, Zapata was an individual standing out against collectivization from either side, a strong, self-contained individual, which the whole world needs right now. So that ends my sort of survey of Steinbeck in Mexico, including embedding Tortilla Flat in that survey. And I am happy to answer any questions. So thank you.